Thank you, Bruce. This is a bit of a somber note you introduced into this conversation. I have to say that at this stage of what we know about science and a dozen or so national academies of science having opined on the issue, it's impossible to take seriously, I think, a candidate for president who doesn't acknowledge it, aside from the preposterous proposal to eliminate EPA. That's right up there with eliminating the IRS. Actually, it's worse. I want to commend David Hayes for organizing this and for the very significant participation by people who really know these subjects. Coming at the end of the day, it would be, I think, quite sufficient for me to try to compile a quick, succinct summary of what has been said, because much of it I agree with and really very significantly agree with, support. I want to say something at the beginning about a report that has just been released this week by the Energy Transmission Commission, something I think was commissioned by the Secretary General of the United Nations, particularly on the consequences and importance and the specific consequences of the Paris agreements. They extracted from the various commitments that have been made 5 significant points. The first of which is a very encouraging one. There can be expected to be a massive expansion of renewable energy in the developing countries over the coming years, reaching up to, and the report talks about the period until 2030. And there will be some $2 trillion needed to support that, that construction, that implementation. Much less is said about the sources of that money in the commitments that have been made by the various countries, most notably China, which has committed 500 gigawatts of solar and 400 gigawatts of wind by 2030. But one has to hope and expect that that capital will be available. To a very large degree, the commitments made in Paris were contingent on the availability of capital from international institutions and private investors. Second, there is also a concomitant and very significant growth in coal-fired power, some 1,600 terawatt hours, 480 in the developed countries, which cancels out many of the gains in the developed world on reducing carbon dioxide. Third, there are very limited measures to decarbonize energy supply beyond the power sector, which accounts for about 1/3 of emissions in the United States as well as in the rest of the world. Buildings, transport, and agriculture are not included in any measurable way in the commitments that have been made by most of the countries. And I was pleased to hear David Hayes talk about land use as one of the very important sinks, and the uses of land is exceedingly important to achievement of carbon reduction. I have noted the Consumer Goods Council's commitments to deforestation and to preventing deforestation of virgin forest throughout the world, and note also that those include the people who trade in something like 13 of the major commodities and have a capacity to have a very significant influence on addressing that problem, including the Indonesian fires that David mentioned. Those will need more support from the next administration than they have had from this one. No one has opposed, actually, we have agreed to those commitments and for the United States to be part of it, but it has not accelerated, it has not influenced, I think, generated as much progress as it might have. I have overseen climate-smart food security for President Obama's Global Development Council. That's a 9-member group that's looking at foreign assistance priorities, development aid, and the like. And as I contemplate the situation of climate change, I'm reminded how many goals, very pressing and important ones, are in competition with the climate goal. And some of which are right directly on point, may in fact distract from addressing the problem. I woke this morning to read the Financial Times report that the largest dam in India, which generates and is designed to generate and has generated 1,000 megawatts of power, is dead in the water. Actually not in the water. There's no water behind it anymore. One of the largest reservoirs in India. And all over India, trains are taking water to villages that have none, and so are tank trucks. That, whether that is understood to be just a secular situation, the consequence of 2 failed monsoons, or whether it's seen as a harbinger of climate change and propels more energy on the climate issue, remains to be seen. But it's not obvious that it will, though all of us here would hope that it would. 1/5 of total emissions reductions committed in Paris depend upon international financial support and technology transfer to 7 developing countries. And in many cases, the commitments are explicitly contingent on receiving those kinds of funds. In the United States, the very ambitious commitments we have made, in fact, do not get us to the reductions that have been promised, that were promised in Paris. We have good intentions, just like other countries, but 1/3 of the policies necessary to get the emissions, 1/3 of the policies necessary to get 1/3 of those emissions have not been characterized. They've not been made specific. And that leads me to comment on the nature of the commitments that were made in Paris. In the councils of the parties that I was most familiar with over the past several years, invariably the most controversial and newsworthy part was the degree to which countries did or did not support or oppose targets and timetables. Those beginning in Rio got the play, and the United States government was heavily criticized for not committing to them. Well, what was done that, as my view, has made this Paris Conference of the Parties successful is basically a surrender on that issue, a willingness to accept countries' own programs, the best that they could do, what they came to the party with, and say, you're in the family, you're in the club, we applaud you, and we'll move on. I support that. I think that was a wise, prudential decision on the part of the organizers of the Conference of the Parties, but it leaves us without much that you can really take to the bank. The future of the commitments that have been made will be determined more, I hope, by the first 5-year review. I guess it's earlier than 5 years, but it remains to be seen how specific they will be. The first obligation, I think, of those who are involved with this is going to be to take the commitments apart, get common baselines agreed to the extent countries will agree to that, common definitions, sectoral understandings, and much more specific commitments to report, to monitor, and to reveal to the public where they are on climate, carbon dioxide reductions. Well, the kinds of things that they're going to have to do suggest a structure of organization that, particularly in developing countries, those of us who had experience with them, have to recognize will require a great deal of assistance and advice. The organization of government, the setting of the climate priority, the kinds of tax systems and incentives, the care with which corruption is dealt with and prevented in terms of the large-scale adaptation expenditures and infrastructure construction that occurs, particularly in the energy field. All of those will need tremendously close attention, and the logical place to set the example, I think, and to really draw on a very successful program of assistance and development in the last 20 or so years is the United States. Our own aid agencies, our own government monitoring and support. That speaks to the issue of leadership. I completely agree with John Podesta that had the United States and China not made the decisions that they made, the commitments that they made before Paris, Paris would not have come to pass and would not have been the success that it was. I visited the climate negotiator for China in Beijing a few weeks before Paris, and the first question he asked me was, what is the likelihood that the commitments made by President Obama will survive his administration? It is very important to the Chinese that they do. it is very important, I think, to the rest of the world that they do. It has never been clearer that the United States, its example, its success, the fact that we have the clean power rule and we have the automobile fuel efficiency standard of 54.5 miles per gallon, which, by the way, is estimated to result in more than 2 million barrels a day of reductions in oil use in the United States. These are profoundly important to maintaining the progress toward addressing the climate challenge. I think that there has never before been more urgency for a U.S. president to mobilize our country, to provide the leadership to the world, for the private sector also to engage. With respect to one of the presentations made, it occurred to me that the loan guarantee program might have been better protected, if not more successful, if the advice that some of us gave to the Office of Management and Budget and the Energy Department to allow private equity to supplant, or rather to support and increase the amount of loan guarantees that were made. Our argument was, let those of us who do this for a living put $1 billion next to $2 billion of federal money and share the risk and share the profits on what happens and what results. I think if the private sector were more actively engaged, and I really applaud the fact that OPIC and some of the financing tools that in the past have not been as flexible and free, merging equity and debt, for example, in the support of projects and companies in other countries and developing countries. Those have been opened up in this administration, and the recommendations of the Global Development Council are to open them up more. Well, we have to hope that our country will maintain its course. We are, as I said to the Chinese negotiator, decarbonizing as a country. That's happening. We're going to meet the goals that President Obama set for the United States in Copenhagen. They're not enough to take us to the goals that were set in Paris, but they are, as we used to say at EPA when we couldn't quite claim full credit yet, directionally correct. We are headed in the right direction, and we have to hope and invest so much in making sure that the next president is committed to slaying the dragons of climate destabilization which have been unleashed upon the earth and the waters. Thank you.